So welcome everyone. Delighted to have this new season of We Contain Multitudes. Nice to see some new faces and also I don't want to say old, but definitely familiar faces. So welcome back. And the title that Barry played, which we will speak about later, and maybe he'll play again, is from a piece that he created called It's Hard to Express. And really he was looking at the ineffable and how we are limited in our words and expression in that form. And so I know that the hope is that we will put aside some of our deep thought and really just experience this conversation this evening. So I'm Tamsin. I'm part of the radio gang with Tom, way behind Tom, Jerry, and Barry. Rod, as you will have read, is an astrologer. He started studying astrology when he was 9, started his professional practice in 1989, and has a master's in cultural anthropology and astronomy, which is founded in actually archaeology, history, and psychology. So the synthesis and his natural ability to synthesize is right inherent in that mix of subjects and disciplines. He is also a Sangoma and a healer, and he has published a number of books, which if you look at the WeContainMultitudes.world website, you can see links to Rod's site. So I'm delighted he's joining us for this conversation. We Contain Multitudes is really an open platform for dialogue and meaning making, and the encouragement is to speak softly and listen deeply, and please engage in the conversation. But I'm handing over to Barry, who is going to lead us this evening with Rod, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Tamsin. Rod and I had I don't know Rod, and I met him for the first time mid-August. And we had a lovely conversation, which just flowed and flowed. And that's what I'd like to do now. We will talk for around 20 minutes between us. Rod will be the focus of attention, not me. I'm just asking the questions. But I mean, what was really striking about the conversation, which was why I'm very excited about this conversation, is Rod is one of those people who has lived a life along a road less traveled, to quote Scott Peck. He has not done conventional things, and very early on in life actually found things around astrology, for example, and has pursued that interest. And when I was a young scholar at Cambridge University, I was in an environment where the only currency was 3 significant figures. If we couldn't express it numerically, it didn't exist. This was the sort of scientific paradigm I was living in. And I think if I'd have met Rod at that stage and heard he was an astrologer and a natural healer, I would have been very skeptical. Because I was very influenced by the kind of logical positivist philosophy that words only have meaning if they can be verified, the use of logic and empiricism. And I've come to see over the years that actually that's a trap. I was wrong. That's a wrong-headed approach to how we understand things. And I've moved much closer to some of the things that Rod's interested in. He's got videos on YouTube. He's been a radio presenter and had a television program, and he has the ability to kind of make complicated things clear and straightforward. So there's an excitement about how do we know things, and we talked about how actually in the world, so much of what we think is absolutely right is actually not proven. A statement attributed to Mark Twain. I don't think there's any evidence he actually said it, but it's not what you don't know that screws you up. It's what you know for absolute certain. I've actually, in preparation for this, read a bit about astrology, and there is a whole body of really interesting stuff there that I hope we can begin to explore. So that's enough about the introduction. I'd like to turn to you, Rod, and ask you, 9 years old, interested in astrology, and it's been a lifelong kind of preoccupation of yours, and you've become very well known as that. What's its basis? How does it work, and why does it matter?
Well, thanks, Barry, firstly, for that very inspiring intro that I feel I have to now live up to. But I think astrology is often misunderstood to be some sort of, magical process by which heavenly bodies, planets, exert some kind of influence over us. And some people even go as far as to suppose some kind of gravitational forces, or you name it. But I think what astrology really is a model for understanding the cosmos and understanding ourselves. You spoke about how you turned out to be wrong, or how we turn out to be wrong in our thinking, as Twain may or may not have said. But the truth is that everything we know is just one model or other, and different models prevail at different times. And for me, if you understand the way that we approach knowledge always as a model, it gives us a little bit more license to kind of accept that it's not definitely true, and it will probably change in the future, and that's all right, rather than this is the absolute final fact of the matter. So astrology is this model that develops in the 2,000, 3,000 perhaps years BC, at first not necessarily written down, but eventually written down by the ancient Babylonians, who had a desire to conquer the world. And so they approached it from a very practical point of view, that if they could understand how the world worked, they would know when they were going to win battles and when not, because I guess people had always connected signs in nature with things that happened on the earth. So the Babylonians actually for 1,000 years wrote down every single day the positions of all the planets and the positions of the clouds, and you name it, everything they could see in the sky. And they were developing a science, which was a science of omens, of course, but was an effort to understand what would happen, because that's what happened in the past under such circumstances. And that would give them the advantage as a conquering empire, because that was their interest in life. They didn't philosophize about it, and they didn't suppose some influence of gods. Right from the beginning, they were kind of reading nature, as they saw it as reading science, but they were reading nature and developing a correlation between what happens in the sky and what happens on Earth. Later on, there's the argument, is it causal or is it a sign? And that's the big argument throughout history and philosophy about astrology, whether it supposes the planets cause things or whether they're just signs of things. And it starts off as signs of things. The Babylonians didn't even name the planets until later on, and they just really observed them and wrote down their movements. And it's really that initial kind of long-term study. It's actually exactly 770 years. 3 copies of that study exist. It's one of the only complete things we keep from Babylon. And eventually, when the Greeks got hold of it, it was the Greeks who turned it into a mathematical model that really described the relationship between the movement of things in space and ourselves. The Greeks, influenced really by Plato and perhaps others, they were trying to describe, as we know, this very classical organized cosmos with a place for us in it. And what they were doing is they were transforming this ancient collection of knowledge. I mean, the Babylonians and everyone else were looking at the sky for thousands of years and describing their myths and their stories and their histories and their beliefs in the pictures they created in the sky as a way of transferring the knowledge and the experience of being a human being. And it eventually became an observational cycle that eventually became what the Greeks turned into a mathematical model. And so it became this model to describe human experience. It becomes a language which can describe human experience, because we know we all have that in common. We can read the Greek playwrights to this day and recognize ourselves 100% in their plays from 500 BCE. So we know that psychologically we're the same as those people and everyone who came before us. So it's this language that is a model that describes a cosmos that includes us in it and that explains our relationship with it, at least in our own language for ourselves. So astrology then is like a very sophisticated way of telling the time. And that is the time, meaning in the cycles and annals of human knowledge and experience, of which every one of us is a part and is not unique. All happened before.
I'm muted. That's really helpful. Thank you for giving us that background. But today, I mean, Rod, you do astrology, and you give you do something every month, because I've seen what your forecast. How does that work? How do you go about deciding what you're going to say, and what use do you feel that it is?
Well, of course, that, as you can hear, that is the oldest use of astrology. So it's what it is originally designed to do. And in our language, we can understand that to mean everything is cycles. That's why history repeats itself, and why psychology and anthropology and everything like that makes sense, because they're not physical sciences. They're sciences that say humans have behaved like this, therefore they will again, and therefore this is why. So therefore you will too. And all these ways, which are ways we have to describe ourselves. So this ancient way of doing that, which has evolved a lot over the thousands of years, becomes this really useful way to understand the historical cycles that we live in. So I'll give you an example. The cycles, especially how we measure them these days, can explain things like the social changes that happen at certain historical periods. So in the 1966-1967 period, there was a combination of two planets that occurs on average around about every 40 or so years, something like that, 37 years. They vary because of their elliptical cycles. And that cycle can be shown to be associated with massive social change. All of that happens in 1966 and 1967, which we saw the world went through major upheaval and major social change. It's the core key of the 60s, revolutionary period. One of the things that happened in 1967 was an interpretation of the Mayan calendar that the world will end in 2012, which is not really what the Mayan calendar said. The Mayan calendar says the calendar ends in 2012. It doesn't mention the world ending, but be that as it may, that comes up. And it's interesting that it's 2012, because in 2012, that same cycle reoccurs for the first time since 1967. And you have this intense concentration of a lot of social upheaval, 2012. And of course, the world doesn't end, but it's just that same cycle that our thinking is starting to work the same way. We're beginning in 2012 to see, oh, it's not so fantastic. The world is kind of falling apart. Things aren't so great. Everything's going to change. And then we hit another cycle, such as the one we're in now, which we could call the pandemic and war cycle, which last occurred in 1982-83. That was when HIV/AIDS was identified and that pandemic happened. And the time before that was 1946, when rations started after the war, because there was no farms and there was no farming and no lines of communication. And people were living under the most dire circumstances after the war, immediately after the war. It was worse than during the war. Same cycle again. And so we harness those cycles, which traditionally, it's looking at eclipses and all of those ways that people measured them, and are able to anticipate at what type of point we are in the unfolding of how change works. The Chinese had a system of divination. People in English call it the I Ching, the Yi Jing. And it's really just an understanding of how change works. And from that, you can extrapolate a whole bunch of predictions. And that's really what we're doing when we do the month ahead. We look at how those cycles are working and extrapolate the changes. that can be brought down to earth two ways. On the one hand, the earth is, of course, part of the picture. This is ourselves in the cosmos. That's why the scientific criticism that, in fact, the cosmos, the solar system is going around the sun, not going around the earth, it doesn't really matter. We're in the model. It's from our point of view. So that's the one way we can bring it down to what's happening on the earth, literally by measuring from the earth to these planets. And the second way we can do that is that countries and places themselves have astrological horoscopes, just like people do. And so we can see how it unfolds over there. It's like how many, particularly British astrologers, started predicting in the beginning of the 1980s that in 1999 the Soviet Union would fall. And that was using the Soviet Union's horoscope, which was as clear as day. A beginner astrologer could have easily seen it. And that's just recognizing a particular cycle that, interestingly, the United States is having at the moment.
So here we are in 2021. What cycle are we in now? What would you say, I mean, are the predictions that we might see, I mean, in the next coming period, maybe the next decade or whatever, that fit with that cycle?
So while it's very concentrated around 2020, and that's, of course, where the turning point event happens. So astrologers in 2019, including myself, saying World War III is just about to happen. I said that on TV in January of 2020, because, you know, I really did believe it, as most people did, most astrologers did. And that was because the cycles of what our ancestors called fate, we call limitation and restriction and constriction and everything that's heavy. That's the classical idea of the planet Saturn. And Pluto, which means trauma and destruction and endings. And just think of Pluto in mythology, this late planet, later named. It's a cycle to us more than a planet. And so those two forces come together, as they do about every 37 years. And so in this context, it's a pandemic, as it frequently is. And the after effects, so we don't just look at one cycle at a time, it's a little bit more complex than that. So it really goes on through 2023. And those 4 years, from 20 through 2023, are the 4 years where, by force and by constrained circumstances, just think the second half of the 40s, we basically slowly build the next world, which is really the next kind of incarnation of our culture. It's not a radical departure from the previous one, but it's pretty big. Would the people in the 1930s recognize the 1950s? I don't think so. So it's that kind of a thing. So we are building that next world. So think of what's really happening here. The way that we relate socially is changing. The way that we're relating professionally is changing through things like Zoom. But what we also can assume is that somewhere behind the scenes, clever technical people are creating much cleverer technology than Zoom by force of demand and force of circumstances, which this pandemic has created. So it's forcing our culture to adapt in new ways. And suddenly, what do we see? Social movements get born again. Women and sexuality and the rise of the trans movement, all of those things which we can reflect back in these big, every time 2 cycles come together, these dates that I've mentioned. We see those big social things that pave the way, that by the time 10 years have gone by, policies and things are beginning to fall in place. And, you know, so it portends the next 40 years before there's maybe another pandemic, or there's a world war, or there's some terrible thing. To an astrologer, hearing everyone say unprecedented all the time about this pandemic, it's like the whole point of astrology is that nothing is unprecedented. And that's part of the calm it can give us, is that everything is supposed to be. You don't have to believe in any kind of exterior spiritual force to know that everything is supposed to be, just because at the very least that's the nature of it. And so it's reading that the astrologer does every month.
Thank you. I mean, I spent most of my professional life thinking about how do we develop a good society? How do we make progress towards justice and equity and fairness and so on? And I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that there is another dynamic which I haven't been aware of, which is this circular motion. I mean, is there any point in striving, or are we condemned to have a kind of polynomial kind of world in which things make progress and then fall back again, make progress and then fall back again because of those cycles? I mean, certainly some historians say that. There's a book called Dark Continent, which talks about how we continually return to the dark ages, and then we find the light and we move. Is that consistent with your ideas, Rod, or is that?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, at least at one level. So it is pretty much consistent in the sense that certainly astrology would describe such cycles, and people who've tried to extrapolate bigger cycles from astrology, many of them would say, for example, that 25,000 years ago, it's an approximate number and it's based on an actual cycle, there might have been great civilizations of the type we have now with electricity, all of these kind of things. And that is completely gone, and that probably will happen again. And there's lots of mythologies about great ages and all of that that might relate to all of that stuff. So certainly it fits with the astrological model and does make good sense to me. Yes, so things do repeat themselves. But what is not necessarily true is that it all is just then pointless. Because I think the danger is that we define ourselves as human beings, or as any living beings, very narrowly as these linear material creatures. And at one level, that is true. But whatever consciousness is, and whatever is the thing that's bigger than us, religious people call it God, and you might call it nature. People like to say the universe, which is an interesting modern word for God, I think. But whatever belief systems people hang on to, the fact that we only can see a small amount and there must be a bigger picture than us. It might just be nature, doesn't matter. Whatever that is, and why ever it contains consciousness. So we're forgetting there is the dimension of consciousness. And that might growing in a different direction in the fourth dimension, going forward, that no matter what changes in the physical world, it's almost as if it powers it. Imagine a turbine, that it's by the turning of the physical engine that the other dimension moves. So consciousness, let's say, if consciousness is trying to grow for whatever reason, without postulating a religion, if we suggest that since everything in nature appears to want to grow, for some reason, it tries to multiply itself and it fights off all the enemies. Everything alive seems to want to do that. So if we can assume that consciousness is doing the same thing for reasons we don't know, but it's doing that. And so it's trying to grow bigger. And whatever exactly that means, it entails this movement in the physical dimension, which is these cycles. And why the ancients described it as karma and burning karma and other lives and all of those things, what they really seem to be describing to me is a material world which fuels consciousness, the purpose behind the universe. Purpose, a very simplistic word, I'm sure, because I don't think those things exist in the way we think of them. But whatever the bigger picture is, whatever is driving it, the material plane seems to be its lowest level. That's the engine room. And us as tiny little fragments of that consciousness going through these cycles, eventually, hopefully learn to, as it were, rise above them, not be trapped by them. So that's why consciousness in the shape of human beings keeps on looking for a way out. And we look for the solution to get, what this mortal coil business of what traps us into the terrible world. You said, is it all pointless? Those are legitimate questions, especially if we only look at it in that one dimension, it becomes especially so. But if we realize, hang on, there is a bigger picture, then it becomes the purpose of each of us is to fulfill whatever our individual role may be as best as possible. Like any ingredient, like any cell in the body, it's got to be as best as it possibly can. And that gives us a reason to want to know ourselves and understand the bigger picture, and a good reason to. and a good reason to learn and improve. Because by learning and improving is how we become what we can call the best version of ourselves. And no, everyone's best version of themselves is equal to everyone else's. There isn't a better job. Being the prime minister is no more important than being the man who collects the garbage. Because without either of them, the whole world will fall down. The society collapses. And even the seemingly most trivial things, the person who teaches some obscure little thing, let's say, putting glitter into photograph albums and making pretty photograph albums, who says, I don't have a purpose in the world. Of course you have a purpose in the world, because that's clearly part of the human expression. Whatever this all is, every single cell in its body counts. So every little cell in the body has got the job of trying to be as best as it possibly can that cell, and not ask why, and not try to be some other cell. So it's kind of, I call it doing what comes naturally, which I think is even at the root of our spiritual journey, is that it should all come from us. It shouldn't come from something outside of us. And that's why astrology's job is not to tell someone who to be. It's more like to hold up a mirror to someone and say, well, you know who you are. And isn't this familiar? Oops. And by seeing ourselves in the mirror, we automatically want to adjust ourselves and be a better version of ourselves, because that's why we have mirrors. So astrology works exactly like that, by reflecting us back to ourselves, by reminding us to be the better version of ourselves. It improves our experience of this difficult planet, and it perhaps contributes to this greater whole, which we cannot see or know and never will, but might still make it worthwhile.
So you've expanded the definition of a human being beyond our simple materialistic scientific notion of what it is to be human. And I mean, we've lost the question about what is it to be human. And I'd like to take you back to some of the other dimensions of your experience, which are interesting, because when we talked before, you mentioned Stoicism, you talked about natural healing, you've gone into these areas of different kinds of thought and different kinds of frameworks. What does that add to you, the way your perspective on what it is to be human and how we can develop in the world?
Well, I think that kind of large view of human and history that I have forces me to realize that there can't possibly be one holy book that is right, or one way of practicing something that is right. If there are all these billions of people on the planet all over it, all over time, then it just wouldn't make sense if that were the case. So similarly to what I've said, the way to be spiritually must arise out of our human experience of the world. And to me, it seems that Stoicism is one of those philosophies. I don't think it's the only one, but that certainly addresses that. It basically says, since the world is like this, the only logical thing to do is to do that. People often are surprised that I'm such a logical and rational person, and I really am, perhaps because of the astrology. But astrology, you know, it's often wrongly put into the occult arts and one of, perhaps even shouldn't be in the divinatory arts. That's one of the arguments that academics have about it. But certainly it's not occult. It's a way that we've always described ourselves and our culture, and it's integrated into everything about our culture as well. So it naturally goes along with many philosophies, and one of them is Stoicism, where astrology basically says the world is like this. Your only option is to accept it. But in accepting it, you can actually have a better life. It's not saying, oh dear, well, the world is like this, I better just go along with that. The purpose of astrology, remember, is a mirror. By looking in the mirror, you can improve yourself given the genes you have. So Stoicism basically says the same thing. And that's what appeals to me. Stoics have the idea that the only thing that's worth putting any of your thoughts, energy, and worries into is that which you're in control of. You should be indifferent to the rest. And that which you're in control of is basically yourself, almost nothing else. And that, again, it is very much what astrology is saying. Astrology is saying, look, your only option to try and get your life better and be the best you is to look in the mirror, not to look out there. So it just naturally seemed eventually to lead me to the Stoics. When I first started reading Marcus Aurelius, I think most people, I'm first exposed to him at high school and had read right past me, even though I was interested in philosophy there, but only very briefly at that time. And but later in my life, Marcus Aurelius, when I read him, like many people, I found that he seemed to describe the world that I knew. And similarly, also when the Stoics described why you must live what you need to do and do what you need to do, because you could be dead tomorrow and then you haven't done it. And you're so busy doing everything for everyone else and so busy doing all the chores and stuff you have to do that you never get around to doing the things you want to do it yourself. It's Seneca who says this basically. And it sounded to me like he was describing the modern world when I read that. And I can imagine all these Roman housewives having to go and fetch their children from school, and they probably did, because not that much changes. They just didn't go in cars. They walked with a slave, or I don't know, our romantic views of the Romans. But it's, people did go to school, boys, and things like that. So they did have all the stuff you've got to do of life and deal with all of that. And then you could die and you haven't done it. And Seneca says everyone puts everything on their bucket list and says they'll do it when they're 50. And what makes them think they're going to live until they're 50? And astrology says the same thing. Astrology says from the moment you're born, it's unfolding. There's no putting on hold later, finding out who you are, or looking in the mirror, in other words. You can't only look at them in the mirror when you're old enough to, go to the hairdresser on your own, and only then start worrying about your hair. So you have to start looking in the mirror from the beginning to help become yourself, not just find out who you are. And so it's that same process that says your only option is to be what you are and do the things that you naturally want to do for you. It's worth noting that Seneca does also say that that also means improving yourself. You should be spending more time on self-improvement than on running around doing things for other people or stuff that you have to do out of obligation. So that's my worldview that says you just got to be who you are. That's your only option in life. But you can do that fantastically.
And presumably enhance your consciousness as part of that.
That's exactly why.
That seems to be the defining characteristic of...
Very much so. Because, one of the things about astrology is that it says things will repeat themselves. So again, you ask that at a historical level. But again, looking at the personal level, where it says the same thing, and it says you're going through cycles and you're going to do it again. And I'll tell you when, if you like, but you will do it again. And people say, what's the point? I thought I learned that. My first marriage was terrible. I thought I'd learned lessons about marriage. And I want to say, it doesn't help you to learn lessons about marriage in terms of your spiritual lessons in life. Sure, it can help you in everyday life. But people think that they're dealing with the karma. They're unburdening themselves of the karma and finally breaking through and lifting their consciousness. And that's not how we do it. If we kept on learning something and putting it behind us, we'd be novices at everything. We'd have done everything once. So we repeat it over and over again until we get master's degrees in it. When you do a master's degree, you do much of the same stuff you did right from the beginning of your bachelor's degree. And you just get more and more expert until you're the master of that same thing. And so astrology says, like the Stoics say, that little thing is you. So instead of wanting new and having to progress and all of these things, concentrate on this one thing. And if you become the master of it, you can smooth off many of the rough edges in your life. You can know things and improve things where they are improvable. It's also worth noting that the ancients in astrology and elsewhere had a much more sophisticated notion of fate or karma than you encounter nowadays, where it's this very black and white thing. And in the tradition of astrology and of the eras that it comes from, it's much more like it's a sliding scale or a spectrum, from things that are absolutely not changeable to things that are changeable with ease. The whole bunch of stuff that's difficult to change but is changeable in the middle that we avoid because it's difficult, but it is changeable. And the purpose of the astrology is to help a person see, by being so self-conscious as this me now, let me change the things that are changeable, not chase after new things or run away from things, because they won't go away. They'll just return. And that's what improves our experience of life, not putting it behind us, but living its forever present over and over again. You know, that's one of the wisdoms of the ancients. They understood that time and was really an illusion. They didn't use exactly that language, but they said it's happening over and over and over again. They didn't mean Groundhog Day. They meant really what Einstein says, and that time is an illusion. There's only an eternal present. But it seems from the material point of view as if it's stretched out in a linear fashion. And astrology says pretty much the identical thing. So that means we're not trying to go somewhere, and we're not trying to get better at. We're over here. We just need to concentrate over here. Just check that mirror. And that's why, as small as it is, the self that it describes takes the whole lifetime to do that. But you've got everything you need with you right at the beginning when you're born.
That's a very interesting perspective, Rod, because we're often looking for something external to ourselves. And yet, you know, there is a mystical tradition which, you know, goes way back, and more modern kind of exponents of it, people like Rudolf Steiner and Barry Long and Eckhart Tolle are saying the critical thing is to find the presence within you, to find the spaciousness, to find the timelessness that actually exists within our consciousness. And a lot of the noise in our minds, and our minds deceive us, actually detract from that, and that we are hoodwinked by modern society because of that. That's a very powerful perspective. I'm going to ask you one last question. There's some really interesting comments by Michael and Tom in the chat, by the way, which are worth reading, but I will be turning it over to you for a discussion at the moment, and people have a free-flowing kind of sense of how they're relating to this. But if there's one, my final question, Rod, for this part of the discussion, because we do need to move to a more participative approach. If there was one thing from the lost, you know, the wisdom of the ancients, that we called this session Lost Wisdom, what would you say that is most relevant that we're not doing at the moment as human beings? You know, one thing from, you know, from the ancients, Greek, Romans earlier.
Well, you know, I think it definitely relates to what we've been talking about, because what is clear about the ancient philosophies is that they were very much about finding themselves. They didn't have the same notion of individuality that, you know, to us is the Enlightenment era onwards, not that notion of individuality that has fragmented the world that we live in. But it was more the understanding of that I am this individual self in a mysterious unknown whole, and my only job is to know myself. We can see fragments in the ancient philosophers talk about knowing thyself, not finding God somewhere or listening to what the priest says, not looking at these external things the whole time, but rather finding knowledge from within. And I think many of the ancient traditions are designed to try and get people, let's put it as to understand themselves to be more than this material being. And it doesn't have to be spiritual soul in the religious sense, just as I've used the word consciousness, that there's unmistakably more to us and probably to everything in that way. So by focusing on yourself is how you'll find it. I think the ancients intuited, without perhaps realizing, of course, that time and space are illusions, that everything is one eternal present, as the modern physicists tell us. And so said, then if you want the secret to the entire universe, it's right here. Because this one space, if there's no time or place, then you're sitting at the center of the universe as we speak, every single one of you. And that means that to understand it, or to get beyond the trap of the mortal body, become aware of that. And many ancient practices were about that. And I think ultimately the lesson to me is that you're born who you need to be. You're born with the equipment you need to find the meaning of life or your purpose, or whatever frame you give it or shell you put it in. But to your purpose as an individual cell of the cosmos, whatever language is appropriate, but your purpose is to be what you're born as best as you possibly can. And what you're born as doesn't mean accept your fate. It means know what the parameters you're working with are, know what the boundaries you're working with are. But within that, you have everything you need to get to your personal maximum. So I think that's what they were telling us.
That's very profound, Rod. Thank you very much indeed for us answering my questions so brilliantly. I mean, one of the things which I've been reflecting on listening to you before I turn over to the questions is this version of science I was taught was actually based on Newtonian physics, which does actually separate space, time, cause and effect. And of course, if you really want to read modern physics, the best, and you want to be able to understand it in the sense that it's clearly written, then the best source, which says exactly what you say, is actually David Bohm's Wholeness and the Implicate Order, which is a brilliant piece of writing, which actually validates the metaphysics that you've actually begun to talk about. So, and I see that Tom has put the Tao physics, which I think is Capra, which is also a very good source for this kind of stuff. So questions, turning it over to you. We'll ask you to stand back now, Rod, for a little bit and allow people to kind of riff on your inspirational words. Who'd like to go? Who'd like to ask a question, make a comment?
Abby's got her hand up.
Lucy, I see you. Lucy.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening. Thanks. Thank you so much, Barry and Rod. I was just typing this in the chat. I'm curious about something. It's really powerful what you've said, and you mentioned the horoscope of the Soviet Union. So that implies or says directly that these patterns apply to non-human individuals, even to something human-made like a nation state. So what are the boundaries then of what, I mean, how do you think about that? Could you, I guess, just say a
really interesting question. It is a question because it raises some of the alternative ideas of what exactly might astrology be or might it be doing. So on the one hand, if we connect it only with the human experience, then that's where astrology is able to go down the road of, say, is it divination, which is asking the gods for a message in whatever form that is. On the other hand, if it's some form of a natural science, which we've learned as an observational science that applies to us, then like the others, it probably applies to everything else as well, in ways we don't exactly know, but where we can recognize the human, we can find. So for example, in this case of a country, the reason why we can do that is because it has a constitution. So we actually draw the horoscope around that. And we say that in astrology, therefore, postulates there's a certain quality to time itself. This is the alternative explanation of astrology. There's a certain quality of time that it's describing and that it's a model for, which is also equally arguable. It's another model of time other than the one we're familiar with. Similar, but a little bit other. And as a model of time, it's able to say something that started at this moment will naturally flow in this way, which is pretty much what the Yi Jing Chinese thing says. By looking at the structure of change, which they saw as it's like a line that keeps on dividing itself 8 times, which is found in the shape of the hexagon things or the tortoise's back. As an example, it's those patterns you see in nature. So they said change works that way. So if you know where you enter, you know what's going to happen next. And so that's how, using the constitution of a country, you can see when it's inevitable. And it's worked perfectly for the Soviet Union, for the Apartheid Republic of South Africa, and for, just in recent times, and for the Egyptian state or monarchy throughout the 20th century. It's fascinating. Huh? It's got perfect astrological cycles. And in fact, the Egyptians, contrary to popular belief, weren't particularly interested in astrology, just as an interesting aside. Thanks for that question, though.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks, Lucy. Abby, you're next.
Hi, thank you so much, and for giving both this perspective and kind of a reframe. I think my question is, I've worked quite a bit in Southeast Asia and a little bit in China. And there was an article, a journal article that recently came out about how, since Virgos are stereotyped as being disagreeable in China, they're discriminated against in terms of dating and in finding jobs. So their astrological sign is literally impacting their livelihoods. And 40% of HR managers discuss their astrological sign when considering hiring. So I guess with your framing, how do you address the complexity of how this has entered society and how it's used possibly to actually lead to worse outcomes for humans?
Well, what's interesting about that, I didn't know that it was so much so in China, because as a result, of course, of the Cultural Revolution, Chinese astrology has largely been lost to China. I mean, we know how it works, and there's still people who can do it, but they seem to have then adopted Western astrology, because in Chinese astrology, of course, there's no concept of such a thing as a Virgo. But in Chinese culture, the way that astrology originally worked, their own astrology, was that the astrology that I'm talking about belonged exclusively to the emperor and was used in order to, further the harmonious relationship between heaven and earth and himself in the middle of all of that. So that was the purpose of astrology. And the peasants essentially developed an astrology of their own, which was kind of based on the seasons. And that was obviously looked down upon. And that's where you found things like signs of the zodiac in their version of that. So there's definitely a cultural idea in astrology in China, presumably about where astrology fits in and how they use it. That's you're going to find in various cultures. So my master's degree was on cultural astrology, and it looks at how societies have used their relationship with the sky throughout the eras and places on the planet. And it probably would not be the first time that people have been discriminated against based on that. The only answer I can give, so, from the anthropological side of me, I can say, well, that's a good example of why we say astrologies, plural, these days, because they describe relationships between humans and the sky. They don't describe some pure science or humanity standing out there on its own that we can go off and study. It's not separated from the rest of our cultures. But then part two of that, and also relating to what Barry said then, is that it speaks to the necessity in all of our modern cultures, or most of our modern cultures, China and the West, to bring astrology back to the place in the culture where it actually belongs. And if people actually understand what it is and how it functions, then there isn't a space to do that with that, because it doesn't actually categorize people that way. So once you understand its richness, even a Virgo in astrology has different moons and risings and other planets, and they're all taken into account. And the fact that you're a Virgo, that idea comes from 1931. I'm talking about astrology comes from 3000 BC onwards. In 1931, they came up with the idea, you're a Virgo, based on the position of the sun. So that's why we need a bit of education. And by allowing astrology back into our culture, where it has been on everyone's cultures for thousands of years, instead of boxing it, as has happened in the last 300-400 years, we won't run into problems like that.
Thank you. Thanks, Rod. Emma, Emma, and then Tamsin. Emma first.
Rod, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating and completely resonates with me. And I'm going to go away and absorb completely what you've been saying. But as somebody who's worked on human rights all my life, I'm puzzled how to deal with the facts. I completely understand what you said about the only important thing is to deal with yourself, look in the mirror and so on. And yet, if I look at other people and trying to do, I mean, if they're not in a position to do the best, to be the best they can, isn't there still, I don't know where morality fits in the world.
Well,
how does one rationalize or decide not to do anymore?
I'm going to try and answer your question. Thank you. It's a really good question. I'm just going to take it away from human beings, just to make it a bit easier and less thought to look at the moral side of it. So say, for example, you want to save the whales rather than the people. You want to save the whales, and it becomes, what's the purpose of saving the whales? If on the one hand, this is how the world is, and we should be accepting that. And on the other hand, I should be worrying about myself, not the whales. But the urge to save whales and the passion I'm going to put into that in order to save the whales is how I find myself, is what I find in myself, etc., etc. So the purpose of saving the whales is not about whales. It's really about the person. And the whales will get saved on the side if that's their natural cycle, their natural unfolding, who knows? But it allows us to legitimately want to save the whales and makes it well worthwhile doing so. And you still become a better person. So my first part of the answer to the question is, I just want to take it back to, in focusing on ourselves, we still have the possibility of everything about reaching out to others, because in so doing, we become the best version of ourselves, or we strive towards. But then in terms also, and that's why I say it's so important that the starting point must be that it must come from us. We shouldn't have to find a tool or a book or an expensive course or good quality food or anything in order for this to be able to be possible. So for me, let's call it the spiritual path. The path to knowing yourself starts with your own body. You can meditate, you can learn breathing techniques, you can use yoga or other postures to master the body or its energies if it has them. And all of those start the journey of becoming a better self. You don't need something outside of yourself. So however constrained your circumstances, you've got the ability to go to a place and shut yourself in for 10 minutes and meditate or something like that and start there. So that's why I say with people, even the most constrained of circumstances, there's no better. The person who's got some fancy, expensive way to go and meet the guru and buy the best courses is no better off than the person who sits in their shack and takes 10 minutes to meditate.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Rob. I'm going to put a link to one of your YouTube videos in the chat box, which actually develops that point quite a lot more. And I think that's, people might find that helpful if you want to download that. Tamsin, you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Rod, as always. But I'm picking up actually also on Emma's question, but also Abby's point. And I know you've told me this before, and so I know I need a reminder. But you know, the thing about so as you know, I have pods as stepsisters and brothers. These are 4 people born on the same day, within 5 minutes of each other, all completely different. And how so part of Emma's question as well is, if you're being the best version of yourself, what accounts for social cohesion in saving the whales, for example, or in social change, and what accounts for difference within individuals who are pretty much sun, moon, rising signs similar, you know.
So to answer your question, I'm going to get back to my statement that astrology is a model. And so like all models, it's convenient and imperfect. It's convenient because it largely describes our experience very well, but it's imperfect because it doesn't describe it completely, and it will eventually break down if it isn't adjusted. So to use the second part of your question first, in dealing with multiple births, astrology is limited in its ability to do that. And my excuse would have to boil down to the way that we choose to measure time has produced that problem for us. We only have 3 hands on our clock, and the result of that is I can only get accurate to that certain level. It also then, to the first part of your question, and it also relates to this as well, is that astrology is also not the whole answer. It's not a complete model of a human being, by no means. So genetics and social experience and family experience, the era that you live in, all sorts of other forces are part of who makes you who you are and how you're going to respond to experience. So that's why astrology fits with Stoicism and says, so your only option is be indifferent to all of those and concentrate on the one that you are in charge of. it's not the whole story, but it is the only one you're in charge of. So that's the best possible thing you could do. But it does very much acknowledge that that's not the whole story. And so on the one hand, it isn't, but of all the models that describe the human experience, by its structure, it's the one that manages to allow all the contradictions to sit together. Most models have to iron out their contradictions and synthesize their oppositions and do all of those kind of things. Astrology doesn't require that. It allows contradictions to sit together. And that model, if you ask me, better describes human experience, where as human beings, we do allow contradictions to sit together. I can be one way with my family and another way with my friends. I look like two different people. And so many different things like that. Astrology really can encompass that. But then given that it's a model that works so well to do all of that, it's going to fall down if you try and ascribe all of an individual's person behavior to that. Because how do you pull out all these contradictions? And how do you describe four people born at the same time, where they've all got the same box of toys, but they can shake them around and tip them out and they'll have four completely different patterns. So like that.
Well, that's great, Rod. I'm going to turn to Jerry next, but just before I do, I just wanted to comment. I spent much of my life building mathematical models to explain things, and most of the time I failed. I generally can explain a bit of it, but not all of it. And yet we give great credence to mathematical models. And I mean, some brave statisticians have come out during this pandemic and basically said, actually, what we really don't know very much, because what we don't know screws up the model, and we only use what we know, which is kind of besides the point in a sense. Jerry.
I'm going to do what Emma did, which is I'm going to say I'm really grateful for what you've done, and I will try and read more and understand better. But I'm just going to put this to you, and I would like to hear what you think. It seems to me that one of the things you're saying that's very powerful. Is this better?
Yeah, that's better.
So it seems to me that what you're saying is this is a model, it's a construct, it's confused, it doesn't cover everything. The reason I like it, or the reason I believe in it, is because in fact it contends with the complexities of things we don't know. And that sounds very much to me like a religion, Catholicism did the same. If you don't have the answers, you just live with the complexities of it. Surely we need. It's not that I accept that there are models that are all pieces of a whole that's much bigger than us, but it seems to me very confusing to say, well, this is best because it absorbs the complexities or the contradictions. I mean, if it's a part of human nature to have contrary beliefs at the same time, that's fair enough. And one of the things humans do is they explain their behavior through constructs that they have created to deal with the complexities of their lives. And if this is all this is, that's fine, but it doesn't help me understand whether there is a predictive value. And it's back to this issue of Russia. If you can do a horoscope for a country or a constitution, what does that mean? Does it mean that that somehow so I don't know. I'm trying to think, for example, of you were saying the United States is currently in trouble. Could you expand further on what is happening in this era that kind of can take us to what do we think about liberal thinking, civil society, having elections and all the rest of it? Does this mean that comes to an end because the model has shifted? I'm not being very clear. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I'll just try to jump in somewhere.
Yeah.
So, okay, so firstly, so I'm saying for me personally, astrology is appealing because it is a model that includes contradictions, although I wouldn't have used the word confused like you do to describe it. So it doesn't claim or want to be confused. It just says it's a limited model. So it's just not going to see everything, but it doesn't say, oh, well, that's okay. But unlike a religion, it doesn't postulate any reason for anything or any final outcome of it. Astrology doesn't include the idea of God or creation, or anything that a religion will use like that as an explanation of the why. Astrology doesn't actually deal with why. So at any particular time in history, any particular culture might have a reason why. There were plenty of Catholics who believed in astrology, despite St. Augustine saying don't, and claiming to have been an astrologer. But because it can fit itself to many belief systems, because it doesn't have a template for a belief in it. The real reason why I like astrology is not just that it contains the contradictions, it's because it can demonstrate itself to be true. So that's a little example of how it demonstrates itself to be true. It describes you like your friends like that. You're with your friends that way, you're with your parents that way, and it gets it right. So it does accurately describe our contradictions, but many other things as well. Because in the end, I think the most challenging thing about astrology, and the reason why our culture won't look at it, and the frustrating thing to astrologers about our culture rejecting it these days, or well, the main part of our culture, is because you can't explain why it works. So astrologers can accurately predict, at the very least, 60% accurately. It's very hard to measure such a thing. But in the sense of get it right, you're going to lose your job, you're going to meet someone, you're going to get married, you're going to have a child, those verifiable, identifiable events in life. Astrology will get most of them right, definitely not all of them. It's clearly an imperfect model. It will get them absolutely wrong sometimes. But most of the time, the model works. And I can postulate philosophies, but no one can ultimately explain the mechanism by which that is true. I can say it's a quality of time, which is the reason why I think we can predict what happens to countries with constitutions, much harder with countries that don't. So you can anchor some of this to the nature of time itself. And if time, as modern physics suggests, is a function of consciousness, not an objective function necessarily, it's directly connected into perception and consciousness, then astrology, again, maybe that's why using time, we can sometimes get it right as well, because it actually is part of the same model. Astrology is a model that includes time and place and space, which is why astrologers ask you what time you were born and where you were born, is because we literally were oriented in time and space, physically, our reading of the sky. But so we're harnessing these observations of time and space, and we're trying to understand how time unfolds, and we get it largely right, but not entirely. And we're trying to understand how the human being unfolds. We get it largely right, but not entirely. But we can't say why. We can't say whether there is or isn't a God. And we can't say to a person, you should or shouldn't do this, because unlike Catholicism, nothing's going to punish you if you do it the other way. So that's what I mean by there's no belief structure to put it, or bigger structure to put it into. You still have to have morals or beliefs or whatever. Astrology doesn't replace them. That's why it's more like a science. But I don't think it's much like a religion, because it lacks most of the features I've ever heard of a religion have. My answer was kind of as various as your question.
Okay, are there any other questions? Emma, you've got your hand up, yeah?
Yeah.
Would you like to?
Okay. Yes, I will. I mean, my question kind of relates to Jerry's in a way. It's about country horoscopes, and I'm particularly agonized by what's happening in both Lebanon and Syria. And I think maybe you've given the answer to Jerry, but is there anything that astrology can help people in those countries, or people concerned about those countries, to foresee what on earth is going to happen to either country? neither of which have strong constitutions. They have constitutions, but they're not strong constitutions.
So, and the constitution part is really just a convenience. The issue of countries having horoscopes is less important in astrology and is a modern innovation. And it's much truer in terms of the big cycles that I was referring to. So one of the things that, and this is what astrologers used to do and still do without constitutions, is where things are overhead or on the horizon, there are all these points in space that people have used since time immemorial, the points of the compass being the best example of them. So they use, so in countries where those planets representing those cycles are on those points of the compass, will be identified. So that's how you would do it in a locality. So if you use countries like that, they're good examples because, of course, in the Middle East, people have been using those cycles since time immemorial. They've spoken about the 7-year cycle of Saturn since biblical times and probably before. So the framework to give those people, as well as ourselves, is to get back to what our ancestors have always told us, that there are these great big natural cycles. And if you study their complexity and when they apply in the location you are, you might have a better way of firstly understanding and dealing with what's going on. And possibly, if it's one of those things where you may or may not have some agency. Astrology, unlike the modern tendency, doesn't suppose that we have any unlimited or possibility of unlimited agency. It says these are the limits of your agency, but the agency exists. So if you understand how the cycle works, it's like understanding how the cycle of time works, the best time to do something. You're free to do it whenever you like. But if you want the best outcome, this is the best time to do it. Much in nature does work that way. And, you know, from seeds to you name it. So many things of the human endeavor do as well. So that's how we would use it in places where we're not using a constitution. And if you ask me personally as an astrologer, the idea of the constitution and countries isn't a strong idea. I have a lot of problems with it. To me, the ancient ways make better sense, where they used the observation of the skies they always had, where they used things rising and setting, and that's how they used localities. And that fits better than the idea that time is readable itself. So as I said, that's an alternative explanation in astrology. So I would use the traditional tools that arise from the Middle East, that their very Babylonian ancestors in that part of the world said, know that when the red planet is in the east, it's time for war, be careful. And maybe some people thought Mars causes war to happen. But what the Babylonians had probably discovered is that there's a natural aggression cycle in human beings, and which we don't recognize because we don't like to think of ourselves as predictable creatures, although we are. But if we knew that we had a natural aggression cycle, say it happens to be 2 years long, just happens to be, then at some point someone's going to notice that every time we go to war, Mars is in the same place because it's got a 2-year cycle. So they'll think Mars is causing it, but they've learned how to time the aggression cycle. And the ancient Babylonians would say to them, when your aggression is peaking, that means Mars is in the east, be careful, speak quietly to your neighbors and don't go near the borders. And actually that can become a way to work with time and perhaps have an easier outcome.
Thank you. But in the cases I'm thinking of, these wars have been going on for decades or 50 years in some cases. And are you aware of astrology forecasts having, I don't know what you call them, sorry, astrology forecasts having been made for, I suppose, this area, because the whole area is being in turmoil?
There must be. Not offhand am I aware. So what typically happens is people in areas do forecasts for those areas. There are a number of Turkish and Iranian astrologers who publish a lot. Obviously, the Iranian ones find it very difficult to publish. They've got to be very careful. And the main Iranian astrologer uses a Vedic Indian astrology as a way of also kind of keeping a little bit out of trouble. And he gets away with murder that way. It's wonderful. He's gotten into translating ancient Turkish texts and all sorts of predictive methods that don't go down in Islam, but he manages to publish. And I think he has done, so for the Middle East area, we will find something there. I don't know that myself. I always focus on South Africa, even though so much of the modern world in the West revolves around what happens in America. I don't even look at that now that the American astrologers look at that, because it is a big enough kettle of fish. But that does lead me, if we finish, to the question that you've raised, Tamsin. So yeah, so I don't really know. We need to ask Middle Eastern astrologers, but they will use natural cycles, not constitutions, to do that there. Thank you. So Tamsin, you reminded me that Jerry also asked about, so what does that mean for the US, and does it mean the end of their constitution and so on? So what's happening in the US is, I mentioned Pluto earlier on, and Pluto's cycle is 248 years long. And that means once every 248 years, in any one place, there's going to be a major kind of, let's call it for the purposes of this conversation, constitutional shakeup. So that makes 2024 248 years since the establishment of the American Republic. So what most American astrologers who've said what they think about that is that it's likely to represent a splitting of America. So it's not necessarily, okay, let's throw out that constitution and get a new one. We're going to get a new one because it's, again, like a civil war or some formation of two parts of America, or maybe more than two, whatever. So it sounds extreme, but in 1980, to say the Soviet Union was going to fall down within 10 years sounded pretty extreme. 20, you know, so you never know. One of my teachers was a very great American astrologer. He's the only person that we know of who in print clearly predicted the events of September the 11th, 2 years before. And he said, he always used to say, by 2050, America is two countries. And he was very determined on that. And he actually used the traditional methods, which don't use the Pluto cycle at all. Pluto was discovered in 1930. He uses the ancient methods, and he came up with by 2050, it's two countries. So now contemporary astrologers looking at the Pluto cycle tend to say it's the events around 2024 that will break America into two countries. It's not impossible, given where we find ourselves now and where America finds itself. I'm sure there are, I don't know, but I'm sure there are people in America who are talking about the possibility of civil war. I don't know how extreme it seems to them. I'm not there, but.
I see Lucy nodding here. I always remember walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, thinking, what the hell is the name of a Confederate general doing on a bridge in Selma, Alabama? I mean, I always found that as a paradox.
Yes. And that makes me think that one of the things, we don't necessarily have to think that, like the Soviet Union, which was also on a Pluto cycle, but not the 248-year cycle. So they also have cycles relative to each other, like the two hands of a clock. So the Soviet Union one was done that way, which is the more typical way we measure cycles. But it's not necessarily like one big event, like the fall of the wall and the 2-year tumble after that. It could be the cracking and straining that we're seeing now, that in some parts of the country, they're tearing down Civil War monuments, whereas in other parts of the country, the white supremacists are rising up. And all of these things, they don't necessarily have to emerge as a civil war. And it might turn out to be, there was a 5-year period or a 10-year period where a lot of those kind of disruptions led to the changes that are there by 10 years' time.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to bring it back again, though, to, this group is a group that does try and look at how can they support the unfolding of social change or social justice, or how does one respond to, and I suppose that's my one thing. If it is fixed in the stars, if that's, how do we actually collectively do anything effective? And, because I can't help but think it can't just be me sitting here with myself and being better. There's surely a way that has to manifest in a I don't know if that makes
Well-
sense as a question.
Well, it does, because what's also important is that despite the concentration around me, each individual, there's also that recognition, as I used the phrase earlier on, that it's all like being cells in a larger body, that there isn't any special significance to the individual, and that we all equal it that way. So if that's true, then there's definitely some kind of benefit of thinking of ourselves as a collective made up of all these individuals, but not as an individual. I mean, as we can see, I think at many levels, in terms of a crisis like the pandemic, one of the reasons we struggle and fail to deal with so much of it is because everyone's in it for themselves. And there isn't like a collective thinking. It doesn't even seem to be a species thinking anymore to me, that how we try and protect ourselves as a species. But I think originally that was much easier to conceptualize, that we're in this together, and my little individual self means nothing. I can go to war and I'll die, it doesn't matter, because the whole war was won. So it's that same notion. Everything is not fixed. Remember, really kind of only 1/3 of things are fixed. 1/3 is fixed. 1/3 can be changed with difficulty. 1/3 can be changed with ease, to simplify that spectrum. So it's not really fixed. It's a negotiation all the time of how far can I push it, what is changeable. In the larger unfolding, the nature of this thing, I can't change it. But at so many micro levels, I can adjust the experience of it. That's what's negotiable. And that engages my consciousness. And maybe that's what causes consciousness to grow, which is maybe why it's doing all of that, because that's what it wants to do. And so there is then a lot of purpose in us acting for a greater good, because it fulfills part of that individual purpose that says, I've got to follow my nature, I must save the people. It's in my nature to want to do that. And on the other hand, it also recognizes that if I am part of a greater body, then I'm not independent of the cell next to me. That if I shine very brightly, some of that light or energy is going to affect the cell next door. If the cell next door has got little electricity and I've got a lot, and I amp up my volume, it's going to vibrate up a bit, and it'll find it easier because there's a lot of effort being done right next door. And so there's a lot of benefits in understanding we're all part of the same thing. It's focused around the individual in the sense that your only possibility of influence is yourself, but that doesn't deny you any impact on the world around you as a result of working from yourself.
Nice.
And so that's why, and that's where we get to issues like working in a greater good mustn't be a vanity. It's got to be, this is who I am doing what I naturally do.
That's very powerful, Rod. And I think it's a very good answer to Tamsin's question, because, taking it back to modern physics, and back to David Bohm in Wholeness and the Implicate Order, he talks about what an individual is and says it is a category that we create out of reality, where actually the nature of reality is much more like a soup mix, and we are all part in a continual flow of being and becoming, and actually our influence is through that system rather than through the individuality that we think of. And that's something of an illusion. And I've been listening to this conversation and thinking that actually one of the enemies we have is binary thought, either or. Either something is this or it's that. And Tom's put in a note to me in the chat about actually the nature of paradox. We have a very kind of two-dimensional, or even at best three-dimensional picture of reality, where actually physicists work in multiple dimensions. So who is to say what is? And I remember reading J.B.S. Haldane's response to Einstein and to Heisenberg, the theory of indeterminacy, when he said, my suspicion is that the universe is not queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose, which is something that I take very seriously, because I think that we are living in a mystery, and you've helped us through this conversation peer into bits that we don't look at. And that's what the purpose of We Contain Multitudes is to actually look at things from different points of view, not to take the conventional, as I did as a young postgraduate researcher all those years ago, of saying actually we have to follow this kind of statistical program, otherwise everything will fall apart. Well, that's clearly nonsense. Yes. And you've really opened our hearts and minds, because I think we need to learn with our hearts as much as we do with our brains. And I suspect that binary logic is an enemy here, because it splits. I'm right and you're wrong is probably the most dangerous statement that we have at the moment, and without any kind of epistemological basis in philosophy, I think. I thank you for everyone for coming. I'm going to close us out now. I had hoped to play you a piece that I kind of came out of me, which came out of the idea that what I want to say, I can never find the right symbols. I find it hard to find words. Actually, the truth I'm trying to say is poorly expressed in words. The truth I'm trying to say is often poorly expressed in numbers. But there is something ineffable for me about music that actually says something. I know exactly what it means, although I can't communicate it in any other way. And that first piece was actually about the mysteries of how we say what we want to say. And all of you have been brilliant in trying to get at these deeper kinds of things that we really need to get out of. One of the things I want to say is I've had a dream forever, a dream that keeps coming back, and it's a fantasy, but it feels very real. And it feels as if I lived in another time. I lived during the great migration from the US South to Chicago in the 1930s, that I live the music of that time and the paintings of that time. Jacob Lawrence painted the paintings. Mahalia Jackson sang the gospel songs. Muddy Waters played the Chicago blues. The 5,000 Pullman Porters were the germs carrying the message of civil rights from the South to the North. Chicago was the promised land. And I've been playing this for all my life, this song that I'm going to play you now and close out with. And it's called Fast Train to Chicago. And Chicago was, of course, in those days, the promised land. So I hope that wherever you are, whatever you're doing today, that eventually you find within yourself the promised land. Because I think Rod's message to me is actually, we have all we need. We need to look within us and we will find it. So be safe wherever you are. And thank you for coming. And I'm going to close out now.